Let's be extremely clear about what just happened, because if you blinked, you might have missed one of the most devastating legal gut punches Donald Trump has taken in his entire second term, and that is saying something. A federal judge just ruled that Trump's so-called law and order strategy, the entire tough guy image he has been projecting by flooding Washington, D.C. with National Guard troops, was illegal. Not questionable, not controversial, illegal. Let that sink in for a moment. The President of the United States deployed troops into the nation's capital without lawful authority. And now a judge has said, you broke the law. And if that weren't enough, within the same legal window, another judge tossed out the criminal prosecutions Trump's Justice Department aimed at James Comey and Letitia James. Just thrown out, gone, obliterated. Because the prosecutor he installed to go after his enemies, improperly appointed, illegally installed. The entire operation, illegitimate from the start. So while Trump has been out there pounding his chest about restoring order, the actual courts of law, real judges, real constitutional authority, just looked at his two biggest enforcement weapons and said, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to use the military like your personal police force. You don't get to weaponize the Justice Department to punish your critics. And you certainly don't get to bypass the law just because you feel entitled to power. If you are watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, you are not alone. Because for years, Trump has been telling everyone that he is the ultimate defender of law and order. And now the courts are saying in black and white that his signature law and order tactics are built on illegal foundations. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting unraveling in real time.
Make no mistake, this is not some technicality. This is not a paperwork error. This is a federal judge saying that the President of the United States broke the law by sending armed troops to patrol an American city. This is another judge saying that Trump's revenge prosecutions were launched by someone who had no legal authority to do so. These rulings strike at the heart of Trump's governing philosophy: rule by force, rule by fear, rule by intimidation. And honestly, it's pathetic, because for all the bluster, for all the macho posturing, for all the authoritarian cosplay, the moment his actions were finally tested against actual constitutional law, they collapsed completely. Instantly. Trump didn't just get checked, he got exposed. And here's the reality that Trump and his allies don't want you to see. These rulings are not isolated incidents. They are the result of a pattern of lawlessness, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of using government power not to protect the public, but to settle personal scores. And now that pattern is finally colliding with the one institution he does not fully control, the federal judiciary. He thought he could just send troops wherever he wanted. He can't. He thought he could build prosecutions out of pure political spite. He can't. He thought courts would cave. They didn't. But wait, because it gets worse for him. Much worse. Because these rulings don't just undo two specific actions, they open the door to a much larger question. How many other parts of Trump's second-term agenda are built on the same illegal scaffolding? How many other abuses of power have simply gone unchallenged? Until now.
And that brings us to the real problem. Not just that these actions were illegal, not just that they were reversed, but that they were attempted in the first place by a sitting president who sees no limits on his power. This moment matters a lot. And by the time we're done walking through what actually happened, how it happened, and why it's part of a much larger strategy, you'll understand why these rulings could mark the beginning of the most serious constitutional reckoning of Trump's presidency. Here's where the spin artists start working overtime. Here's where they tell you, oh, it's just a procedural issue. Oh, it's just a technical glitch. Oh, this doesn't really mean anything. And that's how you know exactly how devastating these rulings really are. Because when the excuses come out this fast, it's because the facts are ugly. Let's start with the National Guard ruling, because this one goes straight to the core of Trump's strongman persona. The judge didn't say this was a gray area. She didn't say this was a close call. She said Trump's deployment of National Guard troops into Washington, D.C. was unlawful. Full stop. He did not have the authority he claimed. He did not meet the legal requirements. He did not follow the statutory framework governing domestic military deployment. And therefore, the presence of thousands of armed troops on American streets under his order was illegal. And let that sink in. For months, Trump has been using those troops as props in a political theater of intimidation. He has stood in front of them to signal dominance. He has pointed to them to project fear. He has used them as living symbols of his law and order image. And a federal judge just reduced that entire spectacle to what it actually was, an abuse of power.
Now, what does the law actually require here? Because this is where Trump's entire argument falls apart. The president does not have blank check authority to deploy military forces domestically whenever his mood strikes. There are statutes, there are constitutional limits, there is the Posse Comitatus Act, there is the Insurrection Act. There are specific emergency conditions that have to be met. There are processes, there are justifications that must be legally established. Trump did not meet those standards. Instead, he relied on a fabricated emergency narrative, a manufactured crisis. He claimed that D.C. was out of control, that local authorities had failed, that only federal military force could restore order. The judge examined that claim and found it wanting. The record did not support it, the facts did not justify it, and the law absolutely did not permit what he did. This wasn't about protecting public safety. This was about projecting power. This was about intimidation. This was about optics. And the court saw right through it. Now, let's move to the second ruling, because if the National Guard decision shatters Trump's idea of law and order on the street, the DOJ decision shatters it inside the justice system itself. The cases against James Comey and Letitia James were dismissed because the prosecutor who brought them, installed under Trump's direction, was illegally appointed. That is not a small detail. That is not a paperwork error. That goes directly to whether the government had any lawful authority to bring these prosecutions at all. Federal prosecutors are not random political enforcers. They are officers of the United States. Their authority comes from the Constitution and from statutes passed by Congress. There are strict rules governing how they are appointed, especially interim U.S. attorneys. Trump's team tried to exploit a procedural workaround to install a loyalist without proper confirmation. The judge said no, that appointment was unlawful. Everything that flowed from it was tainted.
Which means when that prosecutor went to a grand jury and sought indictments, she had no legal standing to do so. The grand jury process itself was poisoned at the root. The resulting indictments were invalid. And the judge didn't hedge, she didn't soften it, she didn't try to save face for the administration. She dismissed the cases outright. And that's the part they really don't want you to focus on, because this wasn't a win on a technicality for Comey and James. This was a federal court effectively saying that Trump's Justice Department had been operating outside the law to pursue political targets. And let's be honest about who those targets were. James Comey investigated Trump during his first term. Letitia James brought civil cases against Trump's business empire that resulted in massive financial penalties. These were not random defendants. These were personal enemies of the president. And now the court has confirmed what everyone already knew. These prosecutions were never about justice. They were about revenge. They were about retaliation. They were about weaponizing the federal government to settle scores. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting. For years, Trump and his allies have screamed that Democrats were weaponizing the DOJ. And now a federal judge has formally recognized that Trump's own administration did exactly that. Make no mistake, the dismissal itself is devastating, but the underlying finding is even worse. Because it puts into the public legal record that Trump's DOJ did not simply make a mistake, it bypassed the law to target political opponents. And that's not me saying it. That's what the ruling establishes.
Now, Trump's allies are rushing out the same tired talking points. The judge is biased. This is judicial activism. This is a vendetta. But here's the problem with that narrative. The legal defect in the appointment wasn't invented by the judge. It's in the statute. It's been in the statute for decades. The administration chose to ignore it. They gambled that no one would stop them. They lost. And this brings us to an even more catastrophic consequence, a consequence the White House does not want to talk about at all. Because in at least one of these cases, the statute of limitations may now block any reindictment, which means Trump's revenge operation didn't just fail, it may have permanently collapsed under its own illegality. So what Trump sold as strength was actually recklessness. What he sold as authority was actually lawlessness. What he sold as justice was actually improvised political vengeance duct taped to the side of the DOJ. And here's the part that exposes the deepest hypocrisy. This is the same man who ran on lock her up. The same man who promised no one is above the law. The same man who said he would restore respect for the legal system.
And now his own deployment of troops is illegal, and his own prosecutions are unlawful. He didn't just bend the law, he broke it. And that brings us to the real question people keep avoiding. How did we get to a place where a sitting president felt comfortable doing this at all? Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. This didn't happen by accident. This didn't happen because of one rogue lawyer or one sloppy memo. This is the product of a philosophy of power, one that views the Constitution as an obstacle rather than a boundary, one that treats institutions as tools, one that sees legal limits as inconveniences.
Trump operated as if he were untouchable, as if the courts would never catch up, as if norms had died and statutes were optional. And for a long time, that gamble paid off. Litigation moved slowly, appeals dragged on, injunctions stalled. He stayed ahead of the system by overwhelming it. But now the system is starting to land punches, real ones. And what terrifies the people around him isn't just that these specific actions were blocked, it's what these rulings imply about everything else still being litigated. It means judges are no longer granting him the benefit of the doubt. It means his claims of emergency powers are being scrutinized. It means his temporary appointments are being audited. It means his strategy of flooding the zone is finally hitting institutional resistance. And that's why you're seeing the panic. That's why the White House response has been so frantic. That's why allies are suddenly screaming about deep state judges, because they can see the momentum shifting. Trump didn't just lose 2 court rulings, he lost 2 core pillars of his governing strategy: militarized intimidation and prosecutorial retaliation. And that brings us to the deeper truth, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. These weren't isolated stunts. These weren't one-off mistakes. These were part of a systematic approach to power that has defined Trump's political life for years. And that's exactly where this story gets far more dangerous, because once you step back from these 2 rulings and stop looking at them as isolated embarrassments, a much darker picture comes into focus. This is not about one illegal deployment. This is not about one unlawfully appointed prosecutor. This is about a governing philosophy that has been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. A philosophy that treats the machinery of government as a personal weapon rather than a public trust. Trump didn't wake up one morning in his second term and suddenly decide to test the limits of the Constitution. This has always been the point. From the very beginning, he has operated on the same core assumption. Power exists to be used against enemies, not restrained by law, not checked by norms, not bounded by institutions, just wielded. Think about how he has always talked about law enforcement: my generals, my DOJ, my military. His language has never been the language of democratic stewardship. It has always been the language of ownership, control, personal loyalty. And if you belong to him, you are protected. If you oppose him, you are punished. That mentality didn't start with the National Guard. It didn't start with Comey or Letitia James. It goes all the way back to his first term, when he repeatedly tried to pressure the Justice Department into opening investigations into political opponents, when he demanded loyalty from the FBI director, when he fired prosecutors who wouldn't bend, when he publicly floated using federal law enforcement against journalists, protesters, and critics. And every time the same pattern played out. Trump would test a boundary, the system would wobble, resistance would come, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, and instead of pulling back, Trump would push harder next time. Because the lesson he kept learning was this: delays work in his favor. Appeals buy him time. Confusion protects him. And by the time accountability catches up, he's already moved on to the next violation. That's exactly what happened here. First, with the National Guard. Trump did not suddenly discover emergency powers. He had been laying the groundwork rhetorically for years, calling cities as war zones, portraying local officials as incompetent, exaggerating crime, inflaming fear. That narrative wasn't accidental. It was the pretext, the justification, the excuse he would later point to when he ordered troops into Washington, D.C. without proper authority. This is the same playbook he used in Portland during his first term, the same playbook he flirted with using nationwide during the George Floyd protests, the same playbook that authoritarian leaders use around the world. Manufacture a crisis, then use the crisis to justify force. And once again, for a while it worked. The troops showed up. The headlines moved on. The courts took time. Trump claimed victory.
He got the images he wanted, the optics of dominance, of control, of strength, and he assumed, as always, that by the time the legal reckoning arrived, it would be too late to matter. Then there's the DOJ side of this, and that pattern is even more blatant. Trump has never hidden his desire to use prosecutors as political enforcers. He has said it out loud, over and over again. Lock them up. Go after them. Why isn't the DOJ doing anything? He has treated criminal prosecution not as a solemn public duty, but as a personal revenge tool. James Comey humiliated him by investigating him. Letitia James crippled his business empire through civil enforcement. In Trump's worldview, that alone is a crime. And once he returned to office with loyalists surrounding him, he did what he had always promised to do. He aimed the machinery of federal prosecution directly at his enemies. And notice how it was done. Not with Senate-confirmed, independently vetted prosecutors, but with interim loyalists slipped into positions through procedural loopholes, people whose authority depended entirely on presidential favor, people who understood exactly why they were there. That is not how a healthy justice system operates. That is how a patronage-based enforcement regime operates. That is how you ensure that the threat of prosecution is guided by loyalty rather than law. And this is the point Trump's defenders desperately do not want to confront. These two dismissals are not just failures of execution, they are exposures of intent. The intent was clear, the targets were clear, the motive was clear. Only the legal scaffolding collapsed.
And if this is how he behaved toward high-profile national figures with teams of lawyers and media attention, ask yourself this: what does that imply about how he views ordinary citizens who lack those protections? What happens when the target isn't a former FBI director or a state attorney general, but a protester, a whistleblower, a journalist, a local official who refuses to comply? This is where the National Guard ruling and the DOJ dismissal intersect in a way that should alarm everyone. Because one ruling says you cannot deploy military force domestically just because you want to show strength. The other says you cannot deploy the justice system just because you want revenge. Together, they expose a single unified strategy: rule through coercion. Troops on the street, prosecutors in the courtroom. Fear as the enforcement mechanism. And that strategy is not new. It is the same strategy used by every illiberal strongman who claims to be defending order while quietly dismantling law. They don't announce the end of democracy. They hollow it out through emergencies, through temporary measures, through exceptional authority, through loyalists in critical posts, through confusion and fatigue and normalization. Trump's great advantage has never been subtlety. It has been repetition. He does the same thing again and again until people grow tired of reacting, until shock wears off, until the abnormal becomes routine, until people start saying, well, that's just how things are now. And that normalization is exactly what these two rulings disrupt. They reintroduce something Trump has always feared: a clear institutional no. Not a debate, not a congressional hearing, not a polite disagreement, a legal wall. A judge saying, you have no authority here, you have exceeded your power, this cannot stand. And that is why the reaction from Trump's orbit has been so explosive. Because for years he has operated as though the courts were either too slow, too cautious, or too divided to restrain him meaningfully. And suddenly, the judiciary is moving with speed and clarity. These aren't symbolic admonitions. These aren't moral critiques. These are binding legal defeats. And this is the part that terrifies autocrats. When the illusion of inevitability breaks, when the facade of untouchability cracks, when power that once felt limitless suddenly encounters resistance that actually holds. Trump does not handle constraint well. He never has. Every time he is told no, he escalates. Every time a limit is imposed, he searches for a workaround. Every time an institution resists him, he attacks its legitimacy. That is what is coming next. You can see it already in the rhetoric about rogue judges and deep state courts. The narrative is being built in real time. If Trump cannot do what he wants, the system must be corrupt. If he is blocked, democracy must be rigged. If his actions are illegal, then the law must be illegitimate. And that is how democracies slide. Not all at once, not with one dramatic collapse, but through an incremental reframing of legality as illegitimacy and power as righteousness. These rulings did not end that threat, but they interrupted it. They forced a reckoning that Trump had been delaying for as long as possible. And that brings us to the most dangerous phase of this entire saga, because when a leader who believes he is entitled to unchecked power begins to encounter real legal resistance, the next steps are never calm. They are never measured. They are never conciliatory. They are desperate. And that brings us to what is now at stake, not just politically, but constitutionally, institutionally, and democratically. And this is where the story stops being about Trump alone and becomes about whether the guardrails of American democracy still function under direct assault. Because what happens next? What Trump does with these defeats will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or merely a pause before escalation. Make no mistake, these rulings didn't humble him. They cornered him. And cornered strongmen do not retreat. They lash out.
Trump's entire political identity is built on the image of unstoppable force, strength without apology, authority without limits. And now that image has been punctured, not by political opponents, not by protesters, but by the one institution he cannot fully dominate, the courts. A judge told him his troops were illegal. Another judge told him his prosecutions were unlawful. That's not just a loss, that's an institutional rebuke. And when you strip away the bluster, when you push past the shouting and the spin, what you are left with is this. Trump's vision of power is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy. Because democracy is built on restraint, on process, on limitation, on accountability. Trump's model of power rejects all four. Here is the terrifying reality that his defenders don't want to confront. If these rulings had not happened, the precedent would have been catastrophic. A president could have deployed military force domestically on pure political pretext. A president could have installed loyalist prosecutors without lawful authority and used them to vengetize political enemies. And if no one stopped it, that behavior would have hardened into normalized governance. That is how a republic erodes, not through one dramatic overthrow, but through the quiet accumulation of illegal power that goes unpunished. And the danger right now is not that these specific actions have been blocked. The danger is what Trump attempts next in response. Because every prior historical example tells us that leaders who seek unchecked authority don't abandon the project when they face resistance. They intensify it. They search for weaker nodes in the system. They pressure different institutions. They attack the credibility of the ones that push back.
You're already seeing the groundwork being laid. The rhetoric about activist judges, the accusations of deep state courts, the suggestion that legal rulings against the president are not legitimate exercises of judicial review, but partisan sabotage. This is not random outrage. It is a deliberate effort to delegitimize the one remaining brake on executive power. And that is why the next phase of this conflict will not be fought in courtrooms alone. It will be fought in public opinion, in state houses, in Congress, in the media ecosystem. Trump will try to turn these defeats into grievances. He will present himself as the victim of a corrupt system that refuses to let him do what needs to be done. And the goal of that narrative is simple: to make disobedience to the courts feel justified. That's the real endgame risk. Not that Trump will lose appeals, but that he will convince enough of the country that court rulings against him don't count, that they're illegitimate, that they can be ignored. Once you cross that line, once legal authority itself is treated as optional, you're no longer operating within a constitutional order. You are operating within raw political politics. This is why these rulings matter so much beyond the headlines. They are a test case for whether institutions still have the will to restrain executive abuse. The judiciary has taken the first step, but courts alone cannot preserve democracy if the public is trained to distrust every outcome that limits a strongman. And that is bringing us to the final, unavoidable truth. The system only works if people choose to make it work. The Constitution does not enforce itself. Statutes do not defend themselves. Court orders mean nothing if the political culture decides they are inconvenient. The entire legal structure of the United States rests not just on written law, but on collective acceptance that law binds even the most powerful person in the country.
Trump's project has always been to fracture that acceptance, to teach people that loyalty matters more than law, that force matters more than facts, that enemies deserve punishment regardless of legality, and that strength is proven through domination rather than constraint. These court rulings are a rejection of that worldview, but they are only the beginning of the test, not the end of it, because now we enter the phase where Trump must decide whether to comply or to escalate, whether to accept limits or to assault the legitimacy of the limits themselves, whether to govern within the law or to treat the law as an obstacle to be crushed. And history tells us that when leaders like this face constraint, they do not suddenly discover humility. They discover urgency. They accelerate. They double down. They gamble that the system will break before they do. That is the danger of this moment. If these rulings hold, they establish that even this president cannot operate above the law, that troops cannot be weaponized for optics, that prosecutors cannot be weaponized for revenge, that emergency powers are not whatever the president says they are. That is the constitutional future worth fighting for. But if these rulings are defied, undermined, or normalized as just politics, then the message going forward is unmistakable. Power decides legality, not the other way around. And once that becomes the rule, not the exception, democratic governance becomes theater, nothing more. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This is not a partisan skirmish. This is not a legal technicality. This is a battle over whether the American presidency is restrained by law or liberated from it. The courts have drawn the line. What happens next depends on whether the rest of the country insists that the line actually matters.
Because if the law only applies when it's convenient, then what we are watching is not the collapse of Trump's law and order strategy. It is the test of whether law itself still survives his presidency. And that is the fight that defines everything that comes next.